On the block, a woman stood alone, rain slicking her hair against her pale face, the thin cotton of her dress clinging indecently to her frame. Julia Mercer did not tremble, though the jeers and muttered jokes from the crowd might have crushed any lesser soul. Her eyes, sharp, green, unyielding, stared out beyond them all, as if searching the horizon for escape. Beside her, on the platform, stood the woman who had condemned her, Abigail Mercer, thick-jawed, eyes hard as iron nails, her voice ringing over the storm like the crack of a whip. "She's barren." Abigail spat, pointing with a crooked finger toward Julia as though presenting spoiled goods. "Couldn't give my boy an heir. A woman with no womb worth nothing but debt. Better she be sold and serve where she might at least earn her keep." A ripple of laughter rolled across the muddy yard. A man in a tattered hat shouted something crude about trading her for a mule. Another lifted his chin and whistled, loud and shrill, as though testing the shape of her humiliation. Julia's jaw tightened. She felt the weight of wet fabric on her skin, the prickle of cold rain sliding down her spine, but deeper still she felt the hollowness in her chest, the years of being called useless, cursed, less than a woman. Her husband had been cruel enough, but his death had not freed her. It had left her bound to the venom of his kin. "Who'll start the bidding?" the auctioneer barked, voice muffled under his sodden felt hat. His hands shook slightly as he lifted the hammer. Even in rain, money was money, and men came when a spectacle promised flesh. A voice from the back, slurred and coarse, cut the air. $2. She'll do for cookin', if not for breedin'. Laughter again, uglier this time. Julia's stomach turned, though her face remained still, as though carved from pale stone. $2, the auctioneer crowed, seizing the lifeline. "Do I hear 3? Another hand rose, belonging to a ranch hand known for his temper and his thirst. 3. 4, shouted the drunk, almost stumbling forward. Rain ran in rivulets down his beard. Julia's breath came tight. With each number, a knot wound harder inside her. To be bartered, passed like tack or tools, her dignity shredded with each laugh. She closed her eyes for a heartbeat, and when she opened them again, the hammer was already raised. Then, a voice cut through the storm. "Come." Steady, firm as oak. 6. Heads turned. The crowd shifted, surprised. The man who had spoken stood at the edge of the yard, tall beneath the slanting rain. His coat was long, patched but clean, his hat pulled low, his face shadowed but resolute. In his hand, he held no flask, no smirk, only quiet certainty. Paul Thatcher. Those who knew him knew he seldom wasted words, and never bluffed. The auctioneer faltered, blinking rain from his eyes. $6. Do I hear 7? The drunk's mouth opened, but no sound came. He swayed, cursed under his breath, and spat in the mud. No one else dared. The yard grew hushed, save for the drumming rain. Paul's gaze never left the platform, never left Julia. $6, going once, the auctioneer muttered, nervous. Twice. The hammer fell with a hollow crack. Sold. A rush of whispers spread, but Paul did not bask in them. He stepped forward slowly, boots sinking into the mud. He did not look at Abigail Mercer, nor the auctioneer. His eyes rested only on the woman who stood rigid on the block, her arms tight against herself, her face unreadable. "You're free of them now," he said simply, his voice carrying even under the rain. He shrugged off his coat and held it out. The storm had plastered his shirt to his chest, outlining the breadth of his shoulders, but his gesture was free of spectacle. It was only warmth offered in a world cold enough to kill. For a moment, Julia did not move. Her pride, raw and aching, wanted no charity. Yet the cold gnawed, and the jeers of the crowd still rang in her ears. Slowly, she reached out and took the coat. It was heavy with rain, but warmer than her own shivering frame. Abigail Mercer sneered, spitting into the mud. "You'll regret it, Thatcher. She's a curse, mark me." Paul did not answer. He guided Julia from the block, steadying her step on the slick boards. His hand was calloused, but his grip held no claim, only steadiness. The crowd parted as he led her toward a wagon waiting by the livery. Beneath the canvas, 3 pairs of wide eyes watched. Boys, triplets, each no older than 7. Their hair clung damp against their foreheads, and their knees were muddy from where they had clambered up to peer out. They stared at Julia with unblinking curiosity, their faces mirrors of each other, yet each carrying some small difference, a tilt of brow, a curve of lip. Julia froze, coat clutched around her, the sight of children cutting sharper than any insult hurled in the yard. The word Baron echoed in her ears. She turned slightly, as though ready to flee. But Paul's quiet voice held her there. "Climb in. The storm won't wait." She hesitated, the ground beneath her boots sucking and pulling, as though the very earth wished to drag her down. Yet the boy's eyes, wide, unjudging, filled with something neither pity nor mockery, pulled at her more. With a breath she did not realize she had been holding, she climbed into the wagon. The boards creaked under her weight, the smell of wet canvas and hay filling her lungs. Paul climbed to the driver's bench, gathering the reins in steady hands. The horses stamped, restless in the storm. With a flick, the wagon lurched forward, wheels squelching through the mud. The town slipped away behind them, voices fading into the roar of rain. Julia sat stiff beneath the canvas, the triplets whispering to each other, stealing glances at her as though she were some strange bird fallen into their nest. "Pa, who is she?" one finally whispered, his voice high and curious. Paul's voice, from the bench, was low, calm. "A lady who needed shelter." The boys seemed satisfied with this, though they continued to study her, 3 sets of blue eyes blinking in near unison. Julia wrapped the coat tighter around herself, shivering not from cold but from the weight of uncertainty. She had been sold, bought, freed, and taken away all in the space of an hour. She did not know this man, nor his children. She did not know if she had traded one prison for another. The rain hammered above her, steady as a drumbeat, and with each mile the world she had known sank farther into the distance. The wagon rolled out past the last buildings, onto the open prairie. Grass bent under the downpour, rippling like dark waves. Lightning flared, silvering the horizon for an instant. In that brief light, Julia looked at Paul's profile, his jaw set, his eyes forward, his hat dripping steady rivulets down his coatless shoulders. He seemed carved of the same earth the wagon rolled over, worn, silent, unmovable. She could not read him, and that unnerved her more than cruelty might have. Hours seemed to pass in the rhythm of wheels and rain. The boys dozed against each other, their breath soft, their small hands curled like kittens' paws. Julia's gaze lingered on them despite herself. Something inside her twisted, ache and wonder intermingled. She pressed her lips tight, swallowing it down. At last, Paul slowed the horses near a copse of cottonwoods, their leaves rattling like wet coins in the wind. He climbed down, mud splashing against his boots, and drew back the canvas flap. His eyes met hers, rain streaking down his face. He did not reach for her, did not order her. He only said, "We'll rest here till the storm eases." She nodded, sliding down carefully, boots sinking in the softened ground. The stormlight painted the world in bruised colors, purples, grays, sickly greens. Paul lifted one boy after another from the wagon, setting them gently on the earth. They stirred but did not wake, trusting his hands entirely. Watching, Julia felt something stir in her chest. Not trust, not yet, but recognition. This was a man who bore his burdens without complaint, who sheltered the small lives tethered to him. He spread a tarpaulin against the trunks, made quick work of a fire despite the damp, coaxing flame from tinder with patience. When the sparks caught, light danced across his features. The straight nose, the faint scar near his temple, the weariness etched in lines too deep for his age. He gestured for her to sit close to the warmth. She did, clutching the coat, feeling the fire's crackle compete with the storm's roar. Neither spoke for a long time. The boys slept under the wagon, curled together like pups. The rain softened to a steady patter, no longer lashing but steady, cleansing. Julia let the heat seep into her bones, but the cold within remained. She dared not believe in rescue. She had been abandoned before. Sold. Discarded. No man's word had ever meant safety. Yet when she lifted her gaze, she found Paul watching her, not with hunger, not with judgment, but with the quiet weight of a man who saw more than he said. The firelight glimmered in his eyes, steady as the hand he had offered her on the platform. The rain eased into mist, curling through the trees. The world smelled of wet earth, smoke, and renewal. Julia drew the coat tighter, heart thudding, uncertain, unwilling to trust but unable to forget the steadiness of his voice. For the first time in years, she felt not the certainty of doom, but the unbearable, fragile ache of possibility. And as the storm gave way to silence, the triplets stirred and blinked up at her, one whispering softly, "Will you stay?" The words hung in the damp air like a spark, and Julia's breath caught. She had no answer. Only the pounding of her heart, and the pull of a future she could neither accept nor deny. The road wound on through the sodden prairie, the storm lessening to a drizzle that shimmered across the fields like a veil. The wagon creaked and groaned with every rut, and Julia sat beneath the canvas with the triplets, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The boys whispered among themselves, their small shoulders brushing hers, their damp hair smelling faintly of hay and wood smoke. She kept her gaze fixed on the shifting horizon, refusing the tug of their curiosity, though she felt it like a rope tightening around her ribs. By the time the wagon pulled into the yard, evening had thinned the light to a dim silver gray. Paul's homestead rose against the horizon, not grand, not new, but steady, as though it had weathered storms enough to know itself unbreakable. The house was timbered and plain, its roof patched in places with tin that glistened in the rain. A barn leaned against the hill's slope, doors wide enough to welcome beasts and men alike. The smell of wet cedar hung in the air, mixed with the sweet musk of horses. Paul slowed the team, his voice low and calm as he coaxed them toward the stable. He climbed down, boots sinking into mud, and extended his hand to Julia. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, her pride stiffening her spine. Then, with the storm still damp on her skin and the boys crowding close, she accepted his palm. His hand was warm, strong, guiding her lightly to the ground as though he knew she had grown weary of roughness. He did not linger. As soon as her feet were steady, he turned to unhitch the team. The boys tumbled down from the wagon in a blur of chatter and mud-splattered boots. They ran toward the porch, their laughter sharp in the quiet after rain. Julia trailed behind, clutching the coat still around her shoulders. When she stepped across the threshold, the scent of wood smoke and bread, stale but homely, met her. The room was simple, pine tables scarred by years of meals, a stone hearth, shelves lined with jars of beans and preserves. A single quilt hung folded over the back of a chair, bright against the muted walls. It was not wealth, but it was shelter. Paul set about tending to the fire, crouching low, coaxing flame from embers with the patience of habit. He did not glance back as Julia stood uncertain in the doorway, dripping onto the worn boards. At last he spoke, without turning. "You'll want warmth. There's a room down the hall. Small, but it'll do." He nodded toward the shadowed passage beyond the hearth. His voice was quiet, matter-of-fact, neither tender nor cruel. "You can set your things there." "I've no things," she said, surprising herself with the sound of her voice. It came raw, like a reed pulled from river mud. He paused, then only nodded again. "Then the quilt will be enough." Rising, he set a loaf of bread and a crock of butter on the table. He did not press her to eat, did not ask for thanks. He simply moved about the house, his steps steady as the ticking of a clock. Julia lingered in the hallway. The small room he'd offered was bare, save for a narrow bed covered with a faded quilt patterned in stars. A chest stood against the wall, its surface worn smooth by years. She lowered herself onto the edge of the bed, her hands twisting in her lap. The storm's weight still pressed against her chest, but the air in the room smelled of cedar and beeswax rather than sweat and smoke. It was the first space in years that did not echo with scorn. From the other room, the boys' voices rose, playful, insistent. She heard Paul's low tone in reply, a voice that anchored rather than commanded. She closed her eyes, listening, the sound almost foreign. Her husband's voice had always been sharp, her mother-in-law's like a lash. This voice was steady, like rain on a roof, carrying no cruelty. She lay back slowly, letting the quilt's weight cover her shoulders. The rhythm of the voices lulled her, and for the first time in months, sleep stole her. When she woke, The fire still glowed in the hearth. Shadows danced against the walls. The storm outside reduced to a soft tapping on the windows. She rose, pulling the coat around her, and stepped quietly toward the main room. The boys sat cross-legged by the fire, 3 identical faces lit with mischief as they dangled string for a kitten to chase. The small creature batted with eager paws, tumbling into their laps as they laughed. Their joy filled the space, unbroken, unashamed. One of them noticed her and whispered, as though in awe, "She's up." The others looked up, their blue eyes wide, reflecting the firelight. Julia froze under their gaze, unsure what to do with such open stares. Then the smallest boy, his voice soft, offered the kitten. "Want to hold her?" The question sliced something loose inside her. Her arms had not held anything tender in years. She hesitated, then knelt slowly, reaching out. The kitten was warm, fur damp from playful tussles, its small heart fluttering against her palm. The boys watched intently, their laughter subdued, their eyes hungry for her reaction. She felt the sting of tears, though she forced them back. "She's soft," she whispered, stroking the kitten's back. The boys grinned, triumphant, as though they had unlocked a secret. Paul stood in the corner, watching quietly. His expression did not shift, but his eyes lingered on the way her lips curved, faint but real. He turned back to the hearth without a word, stirring the fire. Yet Julia felt the weight of his presence like a steadying hand. The days that followed unfolded in quiet rhythm. Rain fell often, soaking the fields, swelling the river, turning the yard into rivulets of mud. Julia rose each morning to the smell of coffee and wood smoke. Paul worked the land in silence, his sons trailing after him like shadows. He never asked her for labor, never pressed her into service. Yet she found herself sweeping the floor, setting bread to rise, mending torn shirts. Her hands moved as if remembering what it was to belong, even as her heart resisted. At night, she lay under the quilt and listened. The boys whispered in the next room, giggling at secrets. Sometimes Paul's voice drifted low, settling them with a story or a hymn half-sung. The sound wrapped her like a cloak. In the darkness, she pressed her face to the pillow, torn between longing and fear. One afternoon, she watched Paul in the drizzle, repairing a fence that the storm had blown down. His shirt clung to his back, the muscles in his arms flexing as he drove each post steady into the earth. He moved with patience, not haste, his strength wielded without arrogance. The boys darted around him, carrying nails, fetching rope, laughing when he ruffled their hair. Julia stood in the doorway, her hands clasped tight. The sight stirred something inside her, envy, admiration, grief for what had been denied her. She pulled back quickly, ashamed of the warmth in her chest. Later that evening, as rain drummed the roof, one of the boys approached her with a torn shirt. "Can you fix it?" he asked, holding it out with hopeful eyes. Julia hesitated, then nodded. She found a needle and thread, her fingers moving deftly. The boys leaned close, watching as she stitched with neat precision. Their eyes shone with admiration, and when she tied the final knot, they clapped as though she had performed magic. She laughed, sharp, unguarded, startling her. Paul, standing at the doorway, looked up at the sound. For a heartbeat, his gaze softened, though he said nothing. That night, Julia lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The word barren still echoed, but the memory of the boys' laughter pressed against it, refusing to let it hold all the weight. She turned to the window, where the rain had thinned into mist. The horizon glowed faint pink beneath heavy clouds. She breathed slowly, the ache inside her shifting, becoming something she did not yet name. The following morning, she joined the boys in the yard, kneeling with them to press seeds into the damp earth. Their small fingers clutched beans, dropping them clumsily into shallow furrows. Julia guided them gently, her hands brushing theirs, the smell of wet soil rising around them. Mud streaked her dress, smeared her cheek. The boys laughed, pointing, and she flicked a bit of mud at them in return. Their laughter rose high, unbroken, ringing against the gray sky. Paul paused at the fence, watching, his chest tightening at the sight. She did not notice him, her hair plastered damp against her face, her eyes bright with something he had not seen before. By evening, the rain had ceased, leaving the land glistening as though washed new. The boys slept in a heap beneath their quilt, breaths soft and even. Julia stood at the window, watching the last light fade. She pressed her palm against the glass, feeling the cool seep into her skin. Behind her, Paul's quiet steps stirred the floorboards. He stopped a few paces away, his presence filling the silence. She did not turn, but she felt him there, steady, immovable. The storm had passed, but the air carried weight still. She whispered, almost to herself, "I do not know if I belong here." The words trembled in the air, fragile, uninvited. Behind her, Paul did not answer at once. His silence was not dismissal, but consideration. At last he said, low, even, "The choice is yours." Then he moved away, leaving her with the fading glow of the sky and the ache of possibility pressing sharp against her ribs. And as the house settled into quiet, a shadow moved at the edge of the field, a lone rider watching, then turning away into the dusk. Julia caught the flicker from the window, her breath catching in her throat. The fragile piece of sanctuary trembled, as though the storm outside had only ever been a prelude to what still hunted her. The prairie in June smelled of wet grass and smoke. Days stretched long, the rain breaking and returning in restless cycles, as though the sky itself could not decide whether to heal or wound. At the Thatcher homestead, work filled the hours between storms, mending fences, checking stock, planting where the soil had softened. Life steadied into rhythm, though beneath it all, a quiet tension pressed like stormlight on the horizon. Julia learned to move within that rhythm. She rose early, sometimes before the boys, setting bread to rise with careful hands. She swept mud tracked in from boots, stitched tears in sleeves, polished spoons until they gleamed in the candlelight. Paul never asked her to do these things, never set demands, but neither did he stop her. She worked not for debt, not for scorn, but because the house seemed to breathe easier when she did. And yet, her heart carried weight. At night, when the boys had settled and the fire sank to embers, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, remembering voices she could not forget. The hiss of her mother-in-law, Abigail Mercer, echoing, "Barren, cursed, no wife, no woman." Those words clung to her ribs like burrs, impossible to shake. She carried them into the daylight, even as the triplets clung to her skirt, even as laughter spilled in the kitchen. One afternoon, Julia stood in the barn brushing down the gelding after Paul returned from market. Dust and straw swirled in golden shafts of light cutting through the slats. The horse's warm hide smelled of sweat and earth. Paul leaned against the doorframe, silent as always, watching. For a long while neither spoke. Julia let the rhythm of the brush steady her, the rasp of bristles against hide filling the silence. Then softly she said, "I was married at 16. Her hand paused mid-stroke. She swallowed hard, then continued, the words dragging from her throat like stones pulled from deep water. "I lost the child. Early. Too early. After that, they called me cursed. My husband, he drank, he beat. When he died, I thought I might breathe again. But Abigail," she stopped, clenching the brush until her knuckles whitened. Paul didn't move, but his gaze held her steady, his silence patient. He did not flinch or offer hollow words. That silence, weighty and still, gave her room. "She sold me like I was nothing, less than stock." Her voice cracked then, raw and bitter. And the worst of it was, I believed her. Believed I had no worth beyond what womb I carried. She set the brush down, chest heaving. Paul's voice came low, like the rumble of distant thunder. "You're not stock, not curse. You're alive. That's enough." The words were plain, but in their plainness lay strength. Julia turned away, tears burning her eyes, unwilling to let him see. Still, the sound of his voice lingered in her, a balm she did not know she needed. Life in the house grew lighter after that, though shadows lingered. The boys adored her presence, each finding a way to claim a piece of her. One brought her wildflowers from the pasture, stuffing them into a chipped jar. Another begged her to tell him stories by the hearth. The third slipped his small hand into hers when they walked to the barn, saying nothing, but holding on as though to anchor her. She resisted at first, telling herself not to grow attached, not to let her heart open. But the seams of her resolve frayed each day, undone by small kindnesses, by innocent laughter. Then came the warning. It was near dusk when a rider appeared on the ridge, silhouetted against a sky swollen with clouds. Paul stiffened at the sight, setting down his tools. Julia watched from the porch, her pulse quickening. The rider dismounted, mud streaking his boots, and raised a hand in greeting. It was Tom Harlan, a ranch hand known more for loose talk than steady work. His face was pinched, his eyes darting as he spoke. "Paul," he said, voice low. "Word is Harlan Mercer's riled. Claims his brother's widow's been stolen from him. Says she was never yours to buy. He's been drinkin', gatherin' men. Talk is he'll ride out this way." The air seemed to thicken. Julia's breath caught, her hands gripping the porch rail. Paul's face remained carved from stone, but a muscle in his jaw twitched. He gave a curt nod. "I thank you for the warning." Tom shifted uneasily, glancing at Julia with a flicker of pity before mounting again. His horse splashed mud as it turned back down the trail, leaving silence in its wake. Julia's chest tightened. Shame and dread welled like a flood. She turned on Paul, her voice breaking. "I've brought trouble to your door. Your boys, your home, they'll pay for my curse." Paul met her eyes, steady as the ground beneath them. "No curse. Just men who think cruelty is law. Let them try." But Julia shook her head, tears spilling hot. "You don't know Abigail. You don't know what hate she carries. Harlan's the same. He'll burn it all to see me crawl." Paul did not answer with words. He only set his hand on the porch rail beside hers, close enough that their knuckles almost brushed. His presence spoke what he would not say aloud. He would not yield. The days that followed grew heavy with unease. The sky turned darker, storms gathering more often, as though echoing the threat. Paul moved with greater purpose, sharpening tools, checking rifles, stacking firewood near the door. Julia joined without being asked, helping men tack, sealing jars, preparing beans and flour. She told herself it was only to keep busy, to numb the fear. Yet part of her longed to prove useful, to silence Abigail's words still gnawing at her ribs. One morning, as they worked the garden together, Paul's eldest, by minutes, though all three were born the same day, asked, "Will the bad men come, Pa?" His voice trembled though he tried to sound brave. "They might," Paul answered simply, pressing seeds into the soil. "What if they take her?" another whispered, eyes darting toward Julia. Paul paused, then set his hand on the boy's shoulder. "No one takes what don't belong to them." The words struck Julia like lightning. She felt her throat tighten, the boy's trust in her binding more than any chain. She knelt beside them, pressing her hands into the wet earth, her fingers brushing theirs. "I won't leave you," she whispered. It was both promise and prayer. Later that night, Julia stood by the window, watching the horizon. The moon broke through clouds, silvering the soaked fields. She saw a flicker then, movement at the far fence line. A rider, shadowed, watching. Her breath hitched, fear crawling up her spine. Paul appeared at her side, rifle in hand, eyes narrowed. The figure lingered a moment, then wheeled away into darkness. "They're coming," Julia whispered. Paul's voice was steady. "Then we'll be ready." Still, when she lay down, sleep eluded her. The boys' soft breaths filled the room next door, their innocence sharp as knives against her chest. She thought of Abigail's sneer, of Harlan's fists, of the laughter of men bidding as if she were a cow at market. Rage kindled in her belly, hot and frightening. For the first time, fear and fury braided together, giving her no room to hide. The next day, she found herself in the barn with Paul, repairing harness leather. The smell of oil and hay thickened the air. She turned to him suddenly, blurting words she had held too long. "Why did you buy me?" His hands stilled on the strap. He looked at her, eyes unreadable. "Because no one else would have given you more than chains." "That all?" she pressed, voice raw. He hesitated, then shook his head. "Because my boys need kindness. And I saw it in you, even when you didn't." Julia's breath caught. She turned away, blinking back tears. The barn seemed to press close, heavy with unsaid things. Outside, thunder rolled, low and promising. The storm was coming. And with it, Harlan Mercer. She stepped into the kitchen to find him at the table, rifle laid out before him. He was cleaning it methodically, each motion measured, steady as breath. The lantern light gilded his profile, sharpening the line of his jaw. He looked up briefly when she entered, eyes meeting hers, and for a heartbeat something unspoken passed between them. "They'll come," she whispered, her voice a thread of air. He nodded once. "Aye." Outside, the boys stirred, their footsteps padding across the floorboards. Julia turned swiftly, smoothing her dress, composing her face. When they entered, eyes bright with sleep, she smiled faintly, though her stomach churned. They sat, rubbing their eyes, unaware of the storm pressing near. By mid-morning, the sky had darkened to bruised purple. Thunder muttered along the horizon. Paul moved about the yard with deliberate calm, stacking wood near the porch, filling the water buckets, checking the door latch. Julia helped without being told, laying food on the table, tucking blankets close to hand, guiding the boys in small chores to steady their restlessness. Each gesture carried weight, as though the smallest act might be the difference between ruin and survival. It was near noon when the first sound came. Hooves, faint at first, then sharper, striking mud and stone in uneven rhythm. Julia froze where she stood, bread knife in hand, her heart slamming against her ribs. Paul stepped to the door, rifle in hand, and opened it slowly. 3 riders emerged from the curtain of rain that had begun to fall. Their coats hung slick, their hats shadowing hard faces. At their head rode Harlan Mercer, jaw clenched, eyes gleaming with the fever of drink and hate. His voice carried sharp even over the storm. "Julia," he bellowed, "get yourself out here. You don't belong to him. You belong to the Mercers." Julia's breath hitched. The boys crowded behind her, clutching her skirts, their small fingers digging into her sides. She stood rigid, every muscle taut, the memory of blows and curses clawing through her mind. Paul stepped out onto the porch, rain pattering against his hat brim, his rifle held with easy steadiness. His voice came low, even. "She belongs to no one. Turn back." Harlan laughed, sharp and ugly. "Bought her, did you? Think a handful of dollars makes her yours? She's Mercer blood. You've no claim." Paul did not flinch. "She's free here. That's all the claim that matters." The men shifted in their saddles, restless. Lightning cracked across the sky, white veins against black clouds. The horses stamped, uneasy. Harlan's gaze slid past Paul to the doorway where Julia stood. His lips curled. "Come now, girl. You know you're nothing but barren ground. Best come back and serve your keep before we take you by force." Julia's chest burned. Shame surged, old and sharp, but beneath it something else rose. Anger, hot and fierce, sparked by the boy's grip on her skirts. She straightened, stepping forward until she stood in the doorway, the storm light striking her face. Her voice shook but did not break. "I will not go back." Harlan snarled, spurring his horse closer. Paul raised the rifle, steady as stone. "One step further," he warned, "and you'll not take another." The yard thickened with silence, broken only by the hiss of rain. The standoff hung taut, stretched near breaking. The boys whimpered softly, clutching Julia tighter. She reached down, resting her hand on their heads, drawing strength from their warmth. Then Harlan moved. With a roar, he leapt from the saddle, mud splashing, fists swinging as he lunged at Paul. The rifle fired, the shot cracking through the storm, but in the chaos it went wide, striking wood instead of flesh. The 2 men collided in the mud, grunting, grappling, raw strength against raw rage. Julia screamed, rushing forward, but the boys clung to her, holding her back. Paul and Harlan rolled in the muck, fists striking, boots slipping, rain plastering hair to their skulls. Paul's strength was steady, deliberate, but Harlan's madness gave him wild force. He struck Paul's face, split his lip, drove him into the mud. Without thinking, Julia tore free from the boy's grip and snatched the rifle from where it had fallen near the porch. Her hands trembled as she raised it, the weight heavy, the rain blinding. Harlan loomed over Paul, fist raised to strike again. Julia's voice rang sharp through the storm. Enough. Both men froze. The rifle shook in her hands, but her eyes were clear, burning with a fire she had not known she carried. "You will not take me," she said, voice fierce, steady now. "You will not lay hand to him, nor step foot in this house." Harlan sneered, blood and rain streaking his face. "You haven't got the stomach." Her finger tightened on the trigger. "Try me." The storm cracked overhead, thunder shaking the earth. For a long breath, no one moved. Then, slowly, Harlan lowered his fist. His lip curled, hate twisting his features. He spat into the mud, stepping back. "You'll regret this, girl." Paul pushed himself up from the ground, bloodied but unbowed, his eyes fixed on Harlan. "Leave," he said, low and cold, "or you'll not walk away next time." The other riders shifted uneasily, their gazes flicking between the rifle in Julia's hands and the unyielding steadiness in Paul's eyes. At last, Harlan hissed a curse, swung onto his horse, and jerked the reins. With a splash of mud and a clatter of hooves, they wheeled away, disappearing into the curtain of rain. Silence fell, broken only by the patter of water on wood and earth. Julia stood trembling, the rifle still raised, until Paul's hand came gently to cover hers, guiding it down. She gasped, tears spilling hot down her cheeks, her chest heaving. The boys burst from the doorway, running to Paul, clinging to his legs, their small voices crying out in relief. Paul bent, wrapping them close, his other hand reaching out toward Julia. She hesitated, then stepped forward, collapsing into the circle of his arm. The rifle clattered to the ground as she pressed her face against his chest, sobs breaking free. "You're safe now," he murmured, though his own voice was raw. Inside, the fire crackled, waiting. They stumbled in together, soaked and shivering, but alive. Paul settled the boys with blankets, pressing kisses to their damp hair, his movements tender even through exhaustion. Julia sat near the hearth, her hands shaking as she held them out to the warmth. She watched Paul move, steady as ever, and felt something inside her shift. For the first time, she did not feel like a burden carried. She felt chosen. Later, when the boys slept in a tangle of limbs and quilts, Julia sat beside Paul by the fire. His lip was swollen, a bruise darkening his cheek, but his eyes were clear, steady. She reached for a cloth, dabbing gently at the blood. He did not flinch, only watched her with quiet intensity. "I've been nothing but trouble," she whispered. He shook his head. "You've been more than that. You've been strength where I thought there was none left." Her breath caught, tears brimming again. She looked down, unable to meet his gaze, but his hand rose, rough palm cupping her cheek. "The boys need you," he said softly. "And so do I." The words pierced deep, breaking the last chains of doubt. She leaned into his touch, eyes closing, letting herself believe. For the first time, she felt not cursed, not barren, but whole. Outside, the storm eased. The rain thinned to a mist, the clouds breaking to reveal the pale shimmer of moonlight. The land steamed, fresh and new, smelling of wet earth and cedar smoke. Julia stepped onto the porch, quilt draped around her shoulders, the boys padding sleepily behind her. Paul stood beside her, his hand brushing hers, rough and warm. Together they looked out at the horizon, where the first stars pierced the clearing sky. The prairie was still, cleansed by the storm. And in the silence, Julia felt the truth settle deep within her. Family was not bound by blood or womb, but by choice, by courage, by the steady hands that held fast through the storm. Her fingers intertwined with Paul's, the boys leaning against her sides. The house behind them glowed with firelight, the land before them stretched endless, and the future, though uncertain, felt possible. In that moment, she knew she was no longer for sale, no longer broken. She was home. And as the last raindrops fell, the prairie whispered its promise. Storms come fast, but so too do second chances.